Here, take these. Thank you kindly, ma'am.
The afternoon sun beat down on the crowded street corner near the luxury shopping district. People rushed past with designer bags and coffee cups, barely noticing the old woman sitting quietly on the cold pavement. She wore a faded shawl over her thin shoulders. Her hands, wrinkled and worn, rested gently on her lap. She wasn't shouting. She wasn't begging loudly. She simply sat there, her tired eyes watching the world go by, her palm open in silent hope. Then came the laughter. A young woman in a bright red dress and expensive heels stopped in front of her. Her lips curled into a cruel smile. She pulled out a handful of coins from her purse and tossed them, not into the beggar's hand, but onto the ground at her feet. The coins scattered across the dirty pavement with a loud, mocking clatter. "There you go," the woman said, her voice dripping with scorn. "Pick them up. That's what people like you do, isn't it? Know your place." The beggar woman didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply looked down at the coins, then back up at the younger woman. Her eyes were calm. Tired, but not broken. She bent slowly, picking up each coin with quiet dignity, as if she had carried this weight her entire life. The crowd whispered. Some looked away in shame. Others just kept walking, because money can buy comfort, but it can never buy character, and one imagined that just days later, this same woman would walk into a billionaire's dinner, and everything would change. Her name was Margaret, but no one on that street corner knew her name. No one asked. To them, she was just another face in the shadows, another invisible soul the world had forgotten. Margaret had not always lived like this. Once, many years ago, she had a home. She had a family. She had a son she loved more than her own breath. But life has a way of taking everything from you when you least expect it. Her husband passed away. Medical bills piled up like mountains she could never climb. The small house they owned was sold to pay debts. And slowly, quietly, she found herself alone, with nothing but the clothes on her back and memories that kept her warm at night. She never shouted for money. She never grabbed at people's arms or followed them down the street. That wasn't her way. Margaret would sit near the cafe, under the shade of a small tree, and simply wait. Sometimes someone would drop a coin into her hand. Sometimes they wouldn't. Either way, she would nod, whisper a thank you so soft it was almost a prayer, and continue waiting. She treated everyone with respect, even those who treated her like dirt. Even those who spat cruel words at her or looked at her like she was less than human. Because Margaret understood something most people didn't. Poverty was her condition, not her identity. She had lost her wealth, her home, her comfort. But she had never lost herself. At night, she would sleep in a small shelter run by a local church. She helped the younger people there, shared what little food she had, and listened to their stories with the patience of a mother. The volunteers at the shelter loved her. They said she had a kind soul. A gentle heart. The kind of heart that didn't harden even after the world had tried to crush it. Margaret didn't complain. She didn't curse her fate. She carried her suffering in silence, the way strong people do when they've learned that dignity isn't about what you own, it's about who you are when no one is watching. And though her hands were empty, her spirit was full. She believed, quietly, that one day things would be better. Not because she deserved it, but because hope was all she had left. Margaret's story began long before the streets became her home. She was once a young woman full of dreams. She married a kind man named Thomas, a factory worker with rough hands and a gentle heart. They didn't have much, but they had enough. A small house at the edge of town. A tiny garden where Margaret grew vegetables. And then, one cold winter morning, they were blessed with a son. They named him Daniel. Margaret held that baby in her arms and made a promise. A promise that no matter what happened, she would give him a life better than hers. She would teach him to be strong, to be kind, to be honest. She would show him that real wealth wasn't measured in gold, but in character. For a while, life was simple and sweet. Thomas worked long hours. Margaret stayed home, cooked meals with whatever little they had, and sang lullabies to Daniel every night. They were poor, but they were happy, and then everything fell apart. Thomas got sick. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away. Then the fevers came. The doctors said it was his lungs. Years of breathing in factory dust had destroyed them. They needed money for treatment. Money they didn't have. Margaret sold her wedding ring. She sold the furniture. She borrowed from neighbors who barely had anything themselves. But it wasn't enough. Thomas died on a rainy Tuesday evening, holding her hand, whispering that he was sorry he couldn't stay longer. Margaret was 28 years old. And suddenly, she was alone with a 5-year-old son and a mountain of debt that buried her alive. She worked 3 jobs. She cleaned houses in the morning, washed dishes at a restaurant in the afternoon, and sewed clothes at night under a dim lamp while Daniel slept beside her. Some nights, there was only enough food for one. And every single time, Margaret gave it to her son. She would smile, tell him she had already eaten, and watch him finish his plate while her own stomach twisted in hunger. Daniel never knew. He never knew how many nights his mother went to bed with nothing but water in her belly. He never knew how she walked miles in torn shoes because she couldn't afford the bus. He never knew how she cried silently in the bathroom, biting her hand so he wouldn't hear, but he did know her lessons. She taught him to always help those who had less. She taught him that kindness cost nothing but meant everything. She taught him to never look down on anyone, because everyone was fighting a battle no one else could see. She told him stories about honor, about courage, about standing up for what was right even when the world told you to stay silent. "Listen to me, Daniel," she would say, holding his small face in her worn hands. "We may not have money. We may not have comfort. But we have something more valuable. We have our hearts. And no one can ever take that from us." Years passed. Daniel grew up strong, smart, determined. He worked hard in school. He earned scholarships. He built something from nothing, and Margaret? She watched him rise, pride burning in her chest like a quiet fire. She had given him everything. Even when it meant she had nothing left for herself, Daniel had become everything his mother dreamed he would be, and more'd be why the time he turned 35, Daniel Cross was a name whispered with respect in boardrooms across the country. He had built a technology empire from scratch. A company worth billions. Offices in 12 countries. Thousands of employees who admired him not just for his success, but for the way he treated people, with fairness, with dignity, with respect. But Daniel never forgot where he came from. While other billionaires bought private islands and flaunted their wealth on magazine covers, Daniel lived differently. He wore simple suits. He drove himself to work. He remembered the names of the janitors in his building and asked about their families. He donated millions to shelters, schools, and hospitals, but always quietly, always without cameras, always without headlines, because his mother had taught him that real power wasn't about being seen. It was about making a difference when no one was watching, and he loved his mother more than anything in this world. Margaret had refused to live in his mansion. She said she didn't need luxury. She didn't want servants or fancy cars or rooms she would never use. All she wanted was a simple life, a quiet life. So Daniel respected her wishes. He made sure she had a comfortable apartment, food, warmth, and safety. But Margaret, stubborn and independent as always, often wandered the city on her own. She visited the old shelter where she once stayed. She sat in parks and talked to strangers. She gave coins to other people who were struggling, even though she herself had once been in their place. Daniel worried about her. He told her she didn't need to go out alone. But Margaret would just smile and say, "I'm fine, my son. The streets raised me. They won't hurt me." She never wanted anyone to know she was the mother of a billionaire. She didn't want special treatment. She didn't want people to bow or change the way they spoke to her. She just wanted to be herself, Margaret, the woman who had survived everything, who had sacrificed everything, and who still believed the world could be kind. Her name was Victoria Lane, and she believed the world owed her everything. Victoria was beautiful, polished, and cold. She wore designer dresses that cost more than most people earned in a year. Her heels clicked like warnings on marble floors. Her perfume was expensive, her jewelry sparkled under every light, and her smile, when she chose to use it, was sharp as a knife. She came from money, but not enough. Her family was wealthy, yes, but not elite. Not powerful. And that drove her mad. Because to Victoria, life was a ladder, and she would do anything to climb higher. She attended every high society event. She laughed at jokes that weren't funny if the right people told them. She flirted, schemed, and calculated every word, every glance, every move. Her goal was simple: marry into real power. Marry a man so rich, so influential, that her name would be spoken with reverence. That doors would open before she even knocked. That people would bow when she passed. And when she heard that Daniel Cross, the billionaire, the legend, the untouchable, was hosting a private dinner and looking for someone to stand beside him at future events, Victoria saw her chance. But there was one thing Victoria despised more than being ignored: poor people that to her. Poverty was a personal failure. A sign of weakness. A stain on society. She looked at homeless people with disgust. She would cross the street to avoid them. And if one dared to ask her for help, she made sure they remembered their place. She made sure everyone around her saw how far beneath her they were. She believed that money equaled worth. That wealth was proof of superiority. That cruelty to the less fortunate wasn't wrong. It was honesty. The day she threw those coins at Margaret's feet, Victoria didn't feel guilt. She felt powerful. She felt like she was teaching a lesson. She felt like she was reminding the world of the natural order. People like her at the top, people like that beggar at the bottom. She had no idea that the quiet old woman on the pavement held the key to everything she wanted, and that soon, very soon, the world would teach Victoria a lesson she would never forget. The grand hall glowed like a dream made of gold and crystal. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of light, casting soft shadows across marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. Long tables draped in white silk held plates of fine china, silverware that gleamed, and flowers arranged with the kind of perfection that only money could buy. The air smelled of expensive wine and fresh roses. Waiters in black suits moved silently, like ghosts trained to never disturb the peace. This was not just a dinner. This was power. This was privilege. This was the world Victoria Lane had spent her entire life trying to enter, and tonight, she had finally made it. She arrived in a shimmering gold dress that hugged her like armor. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists. She walked through those tall doors with her chin high and her heart pounding with victory. She had been personally invited by Daniel Cross himself. She was one step away from becoming the woman on his arm, the name beside his in every headline, the queen of his empire. She smiled at the other guests, those, investors, politicians. People who mattered. People like her, and then she saw her. Sitting quietly at the far end of the main table, near the head seat, was a woman in a simple gray dress. No jewelry. No makeup. Her hair was tied back loosely, and her hands rested calmly in her lap. Her face was kind, tired, humbled. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. No, it couldn't be. It was the beggar woman. The same woman she had humiliated just days ago on the street. The same woman whose face she had laughed at, whose dignity she had crushed under the heel of her expensive shoe. Victoria's legs felt weak. Her smile froze on her face like a mask made of ice. Her mind raced. What is she doing here? Did she sneak in? Is this some kind of joke? She looked around, expecting someone to escort the old woman out. But no one moved. In fact, the other guests seemed to nod at her with quiet respect, as if she belonged. Then the room fell silent. Daniel Cross entered. Tall, sharp-eyed, dressed in a dark suit that spoke of quiet power. He moved through the room with calm authority, shaking hands, greeting guests warmly. And then he walked directly to the old woman in the gray dress. He bent down slightly, and he kissed her gently on the forehead. The room watched in perfect silence. Daniel straightened, smiled, and turned to face his guests. His voice was calm, steady, filled with a warmth that made the chandeliers seem cold in comparison. Good evening, everyone. Before we begin, I want to introduce someone very important to me. He placed a hand gently on the old woman's shoulder. This is my mother. The words echoed through the hall like thunder in a graveyard. Victoria felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. Her face went white. Her hands trembled. She wanted to run, to vanish, to sink into the marble and never be seen again, because the woman she had mocked, humiliated, and thrown coins at like trash, was the mother of the most powerful man in the room, And everyone was watching. The silence in the room was suffocating. Victoria stood frozen, her heart hammering so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. Her perfectly painted smile had crumbled. Her hands gripped her clutch so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to rewind time. She wanted anything but this. Margaret looked at her, not with anger, but with the same calm, tired patience she had shown on the street. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. Daniel noticed the tension immediately. His sharp gaze moved from his mother to Victoria, then back again. He knew his mother's face better than anyone. He knew when something was wrong. "Mother," he said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "Is everything all right?" Margaret hesitated. She wasn't the kind of woman who sought revenge or made scenes. But Daniel's hand was warm on hers, and his eyes were filled with concern. So she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I've met this young woman before, Daniel." Victoria's throat closed. She felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward her like spotlights burning through her skin. Daniel's expression hardened. "Where?" Margaret glanced at Victoria, then back at her son. "A few days ago. On the street near the cafe district. I was sitting, asking for a little help. She gave me coins." For a brief, desperate moment, Victoria thought maybe it would sound like kindness, but Margaret continued. "She threw them at my feet. Told me to pick them up. Told me to know my place." The room went completely still. Daniel's jaw tightened. Slowly, he rose to his feet and turned to face Victoria. His eyes, usually warm and kind, were now cold as winter stone. "Is this true?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was a storm beneath it. Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lips trembled. She wanted to deny it, to lie, to say it was a misunderstanding. But the truth was written all over her face. I didn't know," she stammered. "You didn't know she was my mother?" Daniel's voice cut through her excuse like a blade. "So that makes it acceptable? You treat people like that because you think they don't matter?" Tears welled up in Victoria's eyes, not from guilt, but from fear. From shame. From the realization that everything she had worked for, everything she wanted, was slipping through her fingers. Daniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "My mother taught me one lesson above all others. How you treat people when they have nothing tells me everything about who you are." He turned to the security near the door. "Escort her out." Victoria's world collapsed in an instant. Two security guards stepped forward, their faces blank and professional. They didn't grab her. They didn't shout. They simply stood beside her, waiting. That somehow made it worse, the quiet, respectful removal of someone who had shown no respect at all. "Please," Victoria whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean," but Daniel had already turned away from her. He wasn't interested in apologies born from fear. He had seen enough. "You meant every word you said to her," he replied without looking back. "And now you face the consequences." Victoria looked around desperately, at the other guests, at the elegant hall, at the life she had almost touched. But no one met her eyes. No one defended her. The same people who might have smiled at her minutes ago now looked at her with cold judgment. Because in that room, in that world, character mattered more than beauty. Integrity mattered more than ambition. The guards gestured toward the door. Victoria had no choice. Her heels clicked against the marble as she walked the longest walk of her life, past the silent guests, past the glittering chandeliers, past the dream she would never reach. The doors closed behind her with a soft, final thud. Daniel returned to his mother's side and took her hand gently in his. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes soft with something that wasn't victory. It was sadness. Sadness that cruelty existed. Sadness that someone could be so lost. "You didn't have to do that for me," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "I didn't do it for you, Mother. I did it because it was right." He stood tall, addressing the room with calm authority. "Let tonight be a reminder. Wealth, status, power, they mean nothing if we forget our humanity. My mother taught me that, and I will never forget it." The room remained silent, But every person there understood, justice had been served, not with violence, not with revenge, but with truth. After the guests had left and the grand hall had emptied, Daniel and Margaret sat together in a quiet corner near the tall windows. The city lights sparkled below them like stars that had fallen to earth. The noise, the tension, the drama, all of it had faded into the night. Margaret sipped a cup of tea, her hands wrapped around the warm porcelain. Daniel sat beside her, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his tie loosened. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a son. "You should have told me," he said softly. Margaret smiled. "Told you what? That someone was unkind to me? Daniel, the world is full of unkind people. I've survived worse." "That's not the point, Mother." His voice cracked just slightly. "You shouldn't have to survive cruelty. Not anymore. Not ever again." She reached over and placed her weathered hand on his. Her touch was gentle, the same touch that had soothed his fevers as a child, that had wiped his tears, that had held him together when the world tried to break him. "Listen to me, my son. What happened tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. You didn't humiliate that woman. She humiliated herself. You just allowed the truth to be seen." She paused, her eyes soft but firm. "And that's all we can ever do. Live with truth. Live with kindness. Let the rest take care of itself." Daniel nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He had built an empire. He had conquered markets, signed billion-dollar deals, earned the respect of powerful men and women across the world. But sitting here, holding his mother's hand, he realized that none of it, meant anything without her. "I love you, Mom," he whispered. "I know," she whispered back. "I've always known." A few weeks later, life returned to a quieter rhythm. Margaret still visited the shelter. She still walked through the city, still talked to strangers, still gave what little she could to those who needed it. But now, Daniel made sure she was never alone. Not because he didn't trust her strength, but because he finally understood that love wasn't about controlling someone. It was about being present. One afternoon, while Daniel was visiting a new community center his company had funded, he met a young woman named Elena. She was a volunteer coordinator, smart, warm, and deeply kind. She didn't know who he was at first. She simply asked if he wanted to help serve lunch to the families gathered there. He said yes. They worked side by side that day, laughing, talking, sharing stories. Elena spoke about her own struggles growing up, about how her grandmother had raised her with nothing but love and old furniture. She didn't try to impress him. She didn't pretend to be anything other than herself. And when Daniel introduced her to his mother a few weeks later, Margaret saw it immediately, the goodness in Elena's eyes, the humility in her smile, the strength in her gentle hands. "She reminds me of you," Daniel said quietly as they watched Elena play with children at the shelter. Margaret smiled, her heart full. "Then she's exactly the kind of person you deserve." Months passed. The world kept turning. And while Daniel's name remained powerful, his heart remained humble. Because his mother had taught him the greatest lesson of all, that real wealth isn't counted in money. It's counted in moments like these, where love is given freely, where kindness is returned, where the people who matter most are the ones who see you not for what you own, but for who you are. Margaret lived the rest of her years surrounded by love, warmth, and respect. She never wanted a mansion. She never wanted fame. She only wanted what she had always wanted, to see her son happy, to help those who were struggling, and to live each day with her dignity intact. And she did, because in the end, that was the richest life of all. This story reminds us of a truth we often forget in our busy, distracted lives. The way we treat people when they have nothing reveals everything about who we truly are. Victoria had beauty. She had money. She had ambition. But she lacked the one thing that mattered most: compassion. She believed that wealth made her superior, that cruelty toward the poor was justified, that people's worth could be measured by the size of their bank accounts. And in the end, that belief destroyed the very future she was chasing. Margaret, on the other hand, had lost everything the world tells us matters. She had no home, no money, no status. But she had something far more valuable: her dignity, her kindness, her unshakable belief that every human being deserved respect. And it was that quiet strength, that humble grace, that had raised a son who changed the world. So here's the lesson. Never judge someone by their appearance, their clothes, or their circumstances. You never know who they are. You never know what battles they've fought. You never know whose mother, whose father, whose child they might be. But more importantly, it shouldn't matter. Every person you meet deserves kindness, not because of who they're connected to, but simply because they're human. Treat the beggar on the street the same way you treat a billionaire at a dinner table. Because character isn't shown when people are watching. It's shown when no one is. Wealth can disappear overnight. Beauty fades.